you for the invitation. It is an honor and a privilege to be here. I graduated from this fine institution 20 years ago. I had the, yes, yay, and it's homecoming weekend. I had the privilege of learning from Dr. Eric Selbin, who after my graduation published his book on revolutions, rebellions, and revolt. And it's from that pivotal book, as well as from the teachings of his class, that I began to learn the power of stories, the power of the message and the messenger. And I just want to quote from Dr. Selbin's book, and then I'll want to say a few words about him later. He said, stories have emboldened generations of revolutionaries across time and cultures, and that the possibility of stories, whether it's collective memory or your individual memory, is that it makes you think of your past, it explains a future, and it allows you to envision and enable a future. And when I think of those words from my dear professor, who's now become a lifetime friend of mine, I think of how that relates to the conflict of Kashmir. I also want, as a footnote, to add that I have been waiting for a lecture like this. I have been waiting for a lecture that was titled Revolution and Language, and the marriage of the two, because I come from a family, from a father who is a linguist and a mother who's a revolutionary. And being raised by a linguist, a man who appreciates and analyzes languages, and I must say to my parents are here, so to their credit, my father has spent years and is nearly done. He will have written the first dictionary from Punjabi to English and English to Punjabi, which is phenomenal work. My mother, the revolutionary, I will come to in a moment, and how she has shaped my understanding of this conflict in Kashmir. And as I look at this particular conflict, I see patterns and similarities with other conflicts. Let me also, as a side note, thank you, David, for that phenomenal presentation on languages and the power of words, and that itself, the language warriors that you shared with us. I think my father, to me, is my language warrior. And thank you, Flavia, for your fantastic presentation and the act of silence, which I will come to in a moment. There's something you said that was very striking, which is a power of truth. And when I think about the power of truth, it is also the power of history, which Dr. Selbin, you taught me. Is it history with the capital H, or is it history with the lowercase h? And which history, which perspective of history matters? And when I look at Kashmir, by the way, even though it's focused on women and their stories of survival, suffering, and their struggles, I have to say that women are not disconnected from men. So when we look at any conflict, you have women who in many cases are protectorates of men, women who are nurturers of society and also are protectorates of their children. So that women, to me, in the way that I have written about this conflict, is it's women and men and their children. And you will see that to me, it's the Kashmiri family that I refer to. When we think of Kashmir, most of us, I just want to see a show of hands. Is this a country? Well, you answer the question. Dr. Snyder, you're here too. Thank you, Dr. Snyder. I almost missed you, Dr. Snyder, who taught me all the conflicts that we studied in the Middle East region. That was to you. What a blessing. So Kashmir is not yet a country, but the people there are fighting for their independence. They are fighting for this one pivotal word in their language, which is azadi. And I will explain why azadi, or self-determination, is so important, and why this one word azadi has given rise, has given birth to a generation, or rather generations of revolutionaries, a generation of men and women and their children who take to the streets collectively, because it's a collective struggle, and they are together in their strength and their solidarity. They are committed to a cause. They are dedicated. And yet what I find in a conflict like Kashmir is that it's multifaceted, it's multidimensional, and it's multilingual. So because we just had this fantastic lecture on languages, let's just pause for a moment and we tell you about Kashmir. Is the language is Kashmiri, and they have their own words. It's very separate. But what I found interesting when I traveled in and out of the valley is that most people, residents, will speak Kashmiri at home. It's a local language. It's a spoken language. But it's not the language that they write in or the language that they learn in school. What they learn in school is Urdu, my native tongue. Urdu is the national language of Pakistan. Or they learn Hindi. Hindi is a national language of India. And of course they learn English, because English is a language of, or rather the legacy of British colonialism. So that is a side note on languages. As I traveled in and out of the conflict, I realized that what most of us see, and I say most of us, I mean Westerners, we focus on geography. Kashmir is a place that's known for its idyllic, or rather untouched, beauty. And this is a famous picture, and I've used his name here, Steve McCurry. You may not recognize this photograph of Dal Lake, with its pristine waters. And within Dal Lake, you will find a vegetable floating garden. You will find streams of water lilies. And in the backdrop of the blue-white snow peaks of the mountains, and the gardens that were once built by the great Mughal emperors. It truly is a beautiful place. Steve McCurry is best known, and you will know this photograph, of the Afghan girl with the green eyes. That's his photograph. He's a famous photojournalist, and I'm very thankful to Steve McCurry because he gave me permission to use a picture like this for the front cover of my book on Kashmir. And so what do we know about Kashmir? Again, focusing just right now on geography, is this. You see along the lake, you will find houseboats. You will find in moments of, I would say, calm or tranquility, you do have tourists who would come. Mostly they're Europeans. Few Americans ever come to venture into Kashmir. And you have, when I look back, I actually did some research and I wanted to know, when did the first Westerners or even the first American come to Kashmir? It was in 1914 in the Worldwide magazine that an American traveler described Kashmir as a veritable dreamland. And prior to that, it was in 1665 when you had a French doctor named Francois Bernier who said that Kashmir was, and described it as the torrential beauty of the Indies. Some have said this is comparable to Switzerland. Others have said that it's like the Shangri-La of South Asia. Whatever it is, most of us know Kashmir through its landscape or the Pashmina shawls. And if you own any Pashmina shawls, they actually come, the softest and finest shawls actually also come from Kashmir. Now, where is this valley? This valley is unevenly divided between India and Pakistan. On the orange portion is Jammu and Kashmir, and it's in size, a microscopic, a fraction of the world's population lives in Kashmir. About 10 million people live on the Indian side, and about 6 million live on the green side, the northern areas, which is in Pakistan. What does that mean? Well, think of the state of Texas. Texas is twice the size of all of Kashmir. And geography plays a very important role because you see there's a line. This uneven division is called LOC, the line of control that divides India and Pakistan. And it's very messy, as the kind woman, a student who introduced me, said conflicts are messy. Absolutely, it's messy. And this is a byproduct of partition. So what do I, by the way, at the very top, you'll see China. You'll see the Akshay-Chin portion, which is claimed by China, but there's never been a problem with the Chinese. War over Kashmir has been between two nuclear-armed countries, India and Pakistan. And this is where this conflict becomes even more important, and currently the conflict is in flames again. But if you go back and you're looking at just the geographical aspect of Kashmir, a former Mughal emperor had said that this is where paradise is. And yet I think of the American poet Robert Frost, when he was describing, in one of his verses, he uses the term paradise in bloom. That's how I think of Kashmir. And yet the Kashmiris have also called this the Valley of Death. It's paradise lost, to use that phrase. As one senior militant, we were driving together along the mountains, and he said to me, this is the most beautiful prison in the world. Why is it a prison? Because most Kashmiris will never get a passport, so they cannot leave the valley. And what they do carry with them is an identity card. That identity card is their saving grace. They carry it with them at all times so that they can buy through checkpoints, and when they're searched at any given moment, whether it's in the day or the night hours. To put this into perspective, Kashmir is one of the most militarized zones in the world. There are 700,000 Indian Army or paramilitary troops stationed on the Indian side, the orange portion of Kashmir. That means for every 17 civilians, there's an army officer. Now you think about that. You walk outside the university, you think about walking or living in a police state, or in this case, an army state. On the Pakistan side, you don't have that issue because the Kashmiris on the Pakistan actually identify with Pakistan. And religion plays a very important role. When I said at the beginning this is a multifaceted, multidimensional conflict, you have to also bring in faith, because those of us who've been to India, who know India, it is a Hindu majority country. And so on the Pakistan side, it's a Muslim majority. And so many Kashmiris actually even living on the Indian side, quite frankly, they affiliate themselves with Pakistan because of religion, which is Islam. So this is a way that Kashmir has been defined, and history plays a very important role. 1947 is, August 1947 is a period that has left a mark from my parents' memory. This is a very messy time during the time of partition when both countries, India and Pakistan, were created. August 14th for Pakistan and August 15th for India. They're only divided by one day. And the reason why I call this a messy partition is because you see that Kashmir was one of the princely states. But at the time of partition, when both India and Pakistan was created, there was no agreement on where Kashmir should follow. And without going too deep into the history, at the time there was a Maharaja, he was the ruler of Kashmir, and by late 1947 he had sided with, or at least early 1948, he had sided with India. And so India then claims 2/3 of that territory. To this day, one of the most important legal documents is United Nations Resolution 47, which was enacted on April 21st in 1948. Why do I talk about UN Resolution 47? Because to this day, 70 years later, Kashmiris voice their opinion on Resolution 47, which stipulates that the Kashmiri people in the valley should have a right to vote. There needs to be a plebiscite. 70 years later, that plebiscite has never been enacted by neither India or Pakistan, and may not be as long as I'm alive. But that doesn't stop the freedom fighters. It doesn't stop the revolutionaries. And nor does it stop the madmen, the militants, or the militaries that are fighting against one another for power and control of the valley. So this is why Agha Shahid Ali, who was actually a Kashmiri American poet, he taught at Amherst College in Massachusetts, has written several poems, and he often coins this phrase that Kashmir is burning. My dear friend, like Dr. Selbin, his name is Robert Young Pelton. Dr. Selbin first encouraged me to understand conflict by actually being able to be a witness to conflict. But it was actually Robert Young Pelton, who's a Canadian writer, who has been a National Geographic adventurer. He's been to the world's probably more conflicts in the world than anyone else. He's a true adventurous. And when I was at the time working in the CIA, that was my first career after leaving Southwestern, I was in the Counterterrorism Center. So I've always been studying violence and counterterrorism, and I've actually existed in a very dark, bleak kind of world. Anyone looking at counterterrorism and violent behavior is definitely a world of despair. And he has said about Kashmir when he traveled, Pelton said, Kashmir is a war zone and it's a tourist safe haven. It is what it needs to be to the people who live there so they can make sense of it. And I think he's absolutely right. When I say Kashmir is burning today, we have to pause and think about what's happening statistically. To date, and when I say to date, I mean from 1989, when the first mass revolution, when the first mass uprising from the local people, it was an indigenous movement. From that time period to February 2016, you've had over 94,000 civilians have been killed. At least 1 million other civilians have been arrested. And I'm talking about civilians, not militants or madmen. You've had 10,000 women who've been reportedly raped. Now, these are those who've been documented. There are other cases that are unreported. You have 22,000, at least, women who are called widows or half-widows. If you've never heard of the term half-widow, it means a woman whose husband has disappeared, has vanished, and she has no idea to this day what has happened to him. And there's other statistics like that. I mean, thousands of children who've been orphaned and so forth. So this phrase that Kashmir is burning is true today. And when you think about the women, let me come to the women. This is my mother. And when I say that she's a revolutionary, my mother during the 1965 war between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, she joined the army. She lied to her mother so that she could attend training, and went to Gaddafi Stadium, and she trained. But I learned through my mother and through my grandmother's stories, because again, coming back to the power of story and collective memory, that Kashmir was a place that had piqued my curiosity. I had no reason to go to Kashmir. It was not a conflict that I learned from Dr. Snyder or even heard of from Dr. Selbin, but because it was through my familial and ancestral history, I wanted to know what it was about Kashmir. And my mother used to say that I had asked her, why did you even join the army? Why fight? She said, because I wanted to prove that women can fight too. So she certainly came from a country that was calling and believed in female empowerment and female equality, which is what I found true of Kashmiri women. That Kashmiri women, when they take to the streets, they're also demanding equal attention to women. Women are not just fighting for the rights of and the protection of men and their children, they're also calling attention to their own gender. And so in Kashmir, you find typically the way we think about Muslim cultures, there are certain stereotypes that we have. We say that women are either wives of men or they're mothers of children. And we kind of devoid women or strip them away of their own individual identity. And I have to say that the term Kashmir and the term Kashmiriyat is their individual identity. And so women, when they take to the streets, or, I find in my interviews of Kashmiri women, they're just as passionate. They're just as passionate, and they're persistent, and they're proactive. And so in my own work, when I've written about them, I have focused on political activists, prisoners, and of course, the protesters. And it's the protesters on the street that actually gain the greatest attention because they're what we see. They're the most visible. When they're on their streets, they hurl their voices. And so you can hear them speak. And I have seen protests with myself. I've taken my own photographs, which I'll show you in a moment. And I remember he's a famed ex-militant. He said to me, women share our goals. They are fighters like us. They are ready to die for a cause. So there is tremendous prestige and tremendous respect from the men for the women because they're unafraid. And they are willing to be killed just for taking to the street. So why do women protest? Well, for obvious reasons, if you find in any protest movement around the world, it's a use of language, it's a use of songs of freedom or certain chants so they can call attention to what they consider gross human rights violations against their community, human rights violations committed against their family by who they consider the enemy, the paramilitary troops, and you can see certain examples here. I'm going to come to one particular example in a moment. And I remember that when I was in the valley, now these are my own photographs. From now on, you're going to see my pictures. That when I was watching these women in black, I was actually startled. I thought to myself, this could be the Palestinian territories, this could be in Egypt, this could be Iraq. There were certain similarities between Muslim women. Now these women are dressed, of course, in the all-black garb, and she has the green band, which is the profession of faith. But it's not how she looks that mattered to me, it's what she was saying. And so here's the freedom chant, and you can see that she's blaring through the microphone, and these women they're not even marching, they're taking slow, steady steps. And this was a hot summer day when I visited on the Indian side of Kashmir. They're saying, what do we want? Azadi. Azadi is freedom. What do we want? Azadi. What do we need? Azadi. What are we fighting for? Azadi. Ye Kashmir hamara hai. This Kashmir belongs to us. And so those songs of freedom, as they're marching and they're singing, and by the way, in which language? Which language do you think they're singing in? Urdu. Who said that? Yeah, okay. Yes, ma'am, you're correct. Even though Kashmiri is their local language, they're actually using Urdu. And what you don't see in these pictures is you don't see the swarms of journalists, who happen to be men, by the way. You don't hear the clicking sound, but they're being featured. And that's another aspect of language and revolution that was so powerful, is that even though there's a small group of women, there's no more than 30 women on this particular event, that because they're being featured, the next day they're going to be on online mediums. Social media is going to feature all these women. They're going to be on the front page of local newspapers. So these women, at least they believe that their words have an impact. Now their words, as Flavia, you so eloquently stated earlier, words don't often provide a solution. And I agree with that. Words may not offer a solution to conflict, but their words for these women have an impact. Now these women will be arrested. They were shoved into the trucks, which I don't show you here. And then I asked, what's going to happen to them? And someone said, oh, don't worry. This is an all-familiar scene. They're going to stay in jail for 1 day, maybe 2 days, and then they'll be released. So then these women come back out, and then they'll plan another procession. They'll plan another protest. So it's become a common occurrence. What really struck me was this older woman perched, who squatted on the ground. And if you can read what she's saying, United Nations, where are you? What happened to United Nations Resolution number 47 that promised the Kashmiri people a plebiscite, that promised the Kashmiri people the right to vote, that promised the Kashmiri people would at least have a chance to self-determination? And so that resolution has never been enacted, as I said earlier, but you see that in their collective memory, this has never been erased. They remember this. One of the most, there are many things that startled me about Kashmir. Sometimes we often talk about conflict as an observer of conflict. And I can tell you that I was not just, even though I went to the valley as an observer, I can truly say, as my humble opinion, it changes you. It changes you forever when you meet women steeped in their own grief or their trauma, their anxiety and depression. But then you find these odd cases, and particularly among the youth, who want to affect change. They want to alter the status quo by doing something so daring, so brazen, so unthinkable, that it becomes unsettling and unpredictable to me. So here's this young woman. We're walking under the chalky sunlight. She's wearing her eyes are the color of pigeon gray, which matches her long Islamic dress. And she turns to me, a complete stranger. We had only met the day before, and she said, I volunteered for a suicide operation. Now, I know that this is a nonviolent protest movement. I know that these people believe in Gandhi's principles of using nonviolent campaigns and processions to affect change, which Gandhi did. At least Gandhi played a very important role. And so how does this valley then have this young woman who then went to a terrorist organization, Lashkar al-Taiba, LET, which, as you may remember, is best known for that horrible attack they perpetrated in India in November 2008. They particularly rocked that city. So here this young woman goes to LET and said, I volunteer. I want to commit a terrorist act. And they turn her away. They turn her away because they said, we have enough brothers. We have enough men, we don't need you. But it sparked my interest and curiosity, and so now I am in a dialogue and a debate with this young lady over what Islam says and what Islam doesn't say about jihad. Violent jihad, which in my humble opinion as an American Muslim woman does not exist, even though we see as this is how terrorists manipulate the Islamic faith, and so they're using this. So here's this young woman. So what does she do? She joins an all-women's political organization, and she is in one of those protests that I showed you earlier, and she's often in and out of jail because that's become her life. Now, she startled me, but so did this woman. And this woman, some people take to the streets. Other women, I say that their war, their conflict is in the heart. It's in the heart because they're stricken with grief. And here's a woman, Mowgli, who in January 2009, a local Kashmiri journalist first wrote a story about her, and he called her the lonely mother. The lonely mother because she was literally alone. And Kashmir, I'd say, of all the places I've been in, I would say I've been to over 70 countries and hundreds of cities. I would consider myself at least moderately well-traveled. In Kashmir, I find the blackest nights. Because at night there's a curfew and all the lights literally go off into they're black, so there's no street lights. So one dark night with my driver and a local journalist who must have smoked a pack of cigarettes that night, we're going through a labyrinth until we find this old lady. Now, if you know anything about some parts of the world, there's no address, there's no the street name. So literally probably an hour later we find this woman whose name is Mowgli. And in her home, she tells the most daunting story about how she has lived nearly 20 years looking for her son. Now, in that first mass uprising in the 1990s, her son went missing. He was a school teacher on his way to his school, and he just disappeared. Now, most Kashmiris, when they hear the word disappeared, that means that they're lying in some mass grave. These mass graves have been uncovered years later, and there were thousands of bodies that were recovered, and no one knows to this day who those bones belong to. But he disappeared. And so she said to me, she said, all I want to know, all I need to know as a mother is he dead or alive? And she said, I would lay awake at night thinking, is he hungry, is he thirsty, is he cold? And is he dead or alive? And I said to her, well, what if he's dead? What if you knew? She said, then I would hug his grave. That's all this woman wanted, was to be able to have closure. Now, this woman, when I left Kashmir, a year later, I received news from a local journalist that she passed away. And the news of her death came to me like a stripped-down sentence. I will never forget Mowgli. And then she's passed, but then you have women who are still alive, and women who are alive trying to cope with their own grief. The woman to your right, I met her the day that her son was shot in the head, and somehow she maintained her composure. And then the other woman who looks grief-stricken, her son was shot, and he's paralyzed from the waist down. And then these women live in the most terrible place in the world. They actually live near a sewage dump. And so even to go there was very difficult for me because I could smell the stench of sewage and the stench of, there were literally trucks who come to this part of Kashmir and they're burning trash. So that alone would cause enough grief. And these two women, again, deal with their own psychological and physical loss or violence. So they're impacted by violence in their own way, in their own silent way. And of course, it impacts the children. One dark night when I visited this woman, it was her child had suddenly fallen sick, and so through the darkest night, we had to turn on the light in the van so we could take her to the hospital. You know, women aren't affected in a vacuum. It's also their children. When children lose fathers, or they lose the male family head, because you have to remember, in a very traditional, very conservative society, when women lose the male household, they're losing the breadwinner, they're losing the primary protected, and that leaves women isolated, and it leaves them feeling very vulnerable. But there are certain mothers who continue to live on hope, just as this woman here who goes all the way from Srinagar. One thing I didn't tell you about Kashmir, it's the only place in the world that has 3 capital cities. Srinagar and Jammu in Indian side. On the Pakistan, it's the capital city of Muzaffarabad. So from this city, she goes down to New Delhi, which we know is the capital city of India, and with hopes of meeting her son in jail. And so you have women who continue to believe that someday they will be reunited with their family. I said earlier that you have, as I've said before, I use this term a lot, which is multifaceted conflict. And that is that, you know, most Kashmiris, when they're crying or chanting Azadi, which is freedom, it's actually for a secular state. Because Muslims aren't the only people who live in Kashmir. You have Buddhists, you have Hindus, you have Christians. In fact, a writer years ago wrote a book called The Lost Years of Jesus. There are some Kashmiris who Christians who believe that Jesus Christ was buried there. And so it's a deeply religious society, but it's also deeply tolerant. Very tolerant of each other. And yet you have women like this who is to some secular women, she's a threat. Her name is Asiya Andrabi, and she belongs to a group called Daqtana Milat, which means Daughters of the Faith, which she created in 1981. And when I met her, again, Kashmiri's never amazed to, surprise me. She was telling me this long tale of how her love for Osama bin Laden when he was alive, that the only way forward is a violent jihad, that the only way forward is for there to be an Islamic-style state in Kashmir. Now that, of course, sounds rather scary, but this is her belief. And when I asked, why do you have these very far right-wing-like belief systems, she said, because it's the only way that I can protect the women. So under that black garb that you see there, she has a sword that's about this long that she went to Saudi Arabia and bought, and that's her weapon. And she says, my weapon is my voice, my words, and also this sword. This woman spends her life in and out of prison. I don't know how she does it. In fact, the second time I went, I actually snuck inside Central Jail. I lied my way through into, to the Indian guards, and they believed me. So there I am now in jail, very cold. This is not unlike any American prison, as the paint is peeling off the walls. And this isn't her first time. The first time she was in jail, it was in 1993 with a 2-month baby in her arm, just because of her very radical views. And she is seen as a threat not only to the Indian forces, but a threat to local women as well. And I want to come back to what Flavia said in the first lecture, which is the act of silence. This is an act of silence by Kashmiri women. Those who do not hurl their voices sit silently on the streets holding pictures of their loved ones. It could be a husband, a son. Most of them are male family members, as you see here. And this was started by a woman in the 1990s. Her name is Pravina Aganhar. It's called the Association of Parents for Deceased Persons. And so you can see that it's actually deceased, or not deceased, excuse me, disappeared persons, because all of these people at one time disappeared. And Pravina, who started the organization herself, at one night, the armed forces came into her home and took her 15-year-old boy away from her. So she herself, because she doesn't know where her son is, she started this, it's called a sit-in protest. They go to the main city square and they just sit silently. As you can imagine, that act of silence, of just being present, of holding the pictures of their disappeared, of their beloved, is another powerful way of showing their discontent, their disapproval, and their disillusionment with this protracted conflict. As I conclude here, I just want to say that, I've met remarkable women in Kashmir, and I could say that despite their energy and despite their effort, these women will not be able to end the conflict. The most that they will be able to do is to bring awareness to the conflict. They will be able to share their grievances with the world through online media, which young women are also very actively engaged in. And I truly believe, in my humble opinion, that only when the international community, and I mean here the Western countries, only when the international community becomes engaged and recognizes the contribution of women and their men, that there can be an opportunity for a political settlement on Kashmir. Until then, women and their men will continue to hurl their voices, and until then, a next generation of revolutionaries will be born. Thank you for your attention.